Hi class, welcome to this overview of the unit. Just a reminder that this is a brief overview of the unit, as is not exhaustive of all the material, but kind of to help you see what's going on in the unit and the chapter so that you can make better sense of it and not get lost in all the details. So in this unit we look at the same slab of time period as we have for a bit now, 1800 or 1820 to 1860, and we're looking at reform movements and kind of figuring out what's going on during this time period. And as you will see, it will lead toward our unit on how the Union breaks apart. There's an opening story in chapter 12 where you'll see Abby Kelly, and she's typical of many of the reformers in the United States during this generation and a half. Whoa, it went right by the last bit, so hold on as we kind of bring it back. Sorry about that. Don't know how that happened. All right. So one thing that would be fairly typical about her is there would be an increased role of women in the various movements of reform, and increased meaning they may not even be 50%, depending on the movement, or they could be more than 50%. And there was a general idea, especially among white America from this time period, that women were more morally righteous than men. And so if the public event is reform of society from a bad way to an improved way, this would give women a space to act that they would not necessarily have in other items. So when you check it out, her position overall is like, there's nothing better, when challenged, like, shouldn't you be at home, or shouldn't you be doing other things like than this, she would say, the most precious thing I can leave is a freer, more equal country. So definitely involved in the anti-slavery society, and that's one of the ones we're going to look at. But before we get there, let's look at the background. So the Second Great Awakening occurs, as you check out your book, you'll see it moves around the North and the Upper South, but by far the largest area is upstate New York. And what you find, like the First Great Awakening, is there's this democratization of Christianity, where the writings of the author of John in John 3:5, when Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus in the text about how does one get to heaven, and Jesus says you need to be born again. A reminder of, like, as a reader of this, as a scholarly reader of this, we ask, who was there? Who's writing this down? But it doesn't say. But in this text, Christians in the Americas are reading it, and they see being born again as the way to move forward with Jesus. And so what born again, of course, does in the 1820s, as it could do today for you or your friends or your family or someone you know, is that you could realize your state in life, accept Jesus, and then be born again. This is all done without a formal structure of religion. And so it kind of democratizes religion once again, where once you've been born again, you can help others be born again. And this process of being born again was, in fact, very widespread in the United States, and it's going to have an effect. That's the key thing here. So you can see all the arrows going everywhere here in the United States where the Second Great Awakening moved. You don't need to memorize them, but just notice that they are, in fact, fairly widespread in the North and the Upper South, and that area up there that's kind of a darker blue than just green, that's the area that was, in fact, fairly broad. It was very broad spread, this movement. And so again, they'd have these moving meetings, and speakers could speak for hours or minutes, and people would be persuaded to become better. And that's kind of the big takeaway from the Second Great Awakening for this chapter, is people were persuaded by speeches moving around the United States to be better. And then in most cases, they would enter a body of water and be baptized. Now, Transcendentalism follows a slightly different path. Just want to keep your eye on it, where a kind of secular born again movement developed. That's not true, but it's kind of a way to kind of segue into what we're looking at now. That there was truth beyond the senses if one was self-reflective and questioned all the world they lived in, including, but not limited to, slavery, materialism, social conformity, and patriarchy, that they could experience kind of a divine born-again process. And instead of being a distant heaven, they would kind of find the divine in the everyday reality once you stripped it away from those problems that I mentioned above. So what exists in this time period, especially after 1820 then, is that there are large or small movements to kind of improve their world and become better. And at the beginning, not the beginning, but in the first part of this chapter, it mentions a number of small utopian communities. And this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to reorganize themselves, either through the way they marry, whether it's polygamy or communal marriage or not marriage, whether they have sex, they don't have sex, is it, again, polygamy or communal? Do you raise children together? Of course, if they're not having sex, they're not raising children. And also property, like getting away from private property in some form. This is all going on in a variety of ways, as you can see through the North and the Upper South. So, again, for this overview, I'm not going to go through all the details of all of them, but only point out that when you're reading about the Oneida, Shakers, Owenites, Mormons, Brook Farm, and others, that these are these smaller reform movements that are communal and are trying to fix the world as they see it and what's wrong with it. And they're a lot like, not exactly, but a lot like communes in the 1960s, where you kind of get away from the materialist, paternalist, the suburban rat race world, and you try and make a version of life that's more grounded in what you see as the proper values. So, okay. Now looking at again, at an overview only level, some of the bigger issues and reform movements of this time period. The first is the temperance movement. The temperance movement is in fact a movement to drink less alcohol or zero alcohol. The American Temperance Society is already going by the 1820s, and you can see by the 1830s there are thousands of units. Now, women are more active in this because women see domestic violence and other problems from drinking as a female-specific problem. There is also what today might be called racist, but is harder for us in modern world to see this as a racist problem. It is that the dominant group in the United States sees Irish and Catholics as the drinkers and not themselves. It also has an anti-Catholic element. It's kind of interesting to us today to see how race and whiteness is defined, but that'll be a topic for another course. We won't go into it in this one. So, by 1851, there are prohibition laws. You might have thought prohibition was a 1900s thing, but it's already going on in the 1800s. And by before 1860, so in the 1850s, there are 15 states in all that do pass laws against drinking. The details is that they don't enforce them all the same, and there are court cases against them, but the main point is I want you to see that the temperance movement is a larger than the utopian community's attempt to try and reform the United States to make it better. And it uses, again, these meetings like the Second Great Awakening to spread its message. So, now in their propaganda, they would use visuals like this to show that, step one on the left, a glass with a friend, can then be a slippery slope as you go up and over the end and become a drunk and then die by suicide. And there are many of these. And you notice again that the males are the drinkers, according to the propaganda. And down below you see the woman and child of the man who suffer as a result of this. And there's also, just if you look carefully, there's looking at an industrialized world and how the industrialized world is leaving behind the women and children and the men are working. You'll find in the chapter, and you can go over it yourself, there are a number of reform movements that are fairly large, bigger than the utopian communities, but not as large as the last two we're going to look at. And Dorothea Dix represents is a representation of this, whether it's reforming asylums so that they are there to improve the person inside and rehabilitate them. Same with prisons and orphanages and poorhouses and public schools. These are all going to help teach the proper moral position. Now, for the last two movements who become the largest of the two, the first is abolitionism. And as you will do your reading, you'll find that there is an argument among the dominant white population towards an abolitionism that makes people of color or African Americans leave the United States. And there's also one that says, no, African Americans are part of America. They have been so for hundreds of years. Let's let us, who are not African American, afford those who are African American equality. Just simple social, political equality. And William Lloyd Garrison, who we're seeing on the left, and David Walker on the right, those are both African Americans and white Americans who want to turn blacks into citizens and have them be completely equal. Frederick Douglass is, of course, a great American who follows this argument as well. And here are some visuals for David Walker and Frederick Douglass. And they simply want to create a multiracial democracy of equals. And this was a hard thing to do. Even among the non-South white population in the North, that was a radical idea. And so, like the Second Great Awakening, abolitionists, whether they be white or black, would use similar tactics as the Second Great Awakening and try to persuade them. And so you'd start to find in the decades approaching the 1840s, a growth in this process. Here's a map that shows you an increase in the number of petitions and people signing abolitionist documents moving towards the 1840s. Here is a PDF of one of those petitions from Philadelphia. Now, not necessarily in your text, but an interesting side story is Prudence Campbell. So in the north of New York and Connecticut, Prudence Campbell ran the Canterbury Female Boarding School, and you can see it on the left, and there she is on the right. And it was a pretty successful school. Now, in 1831, Prudence, who was had been educated by the Quakers, who again, since really, Unit 2 of this course, you can kind of look back and see they've been pushing for the most radical equality of all adults, that all adults are equal. Prudence Campbell, daring to believe that all adults were equal, then admits, so this is a boarding school. Again, let me go back one more second before we do 1831. There are a dozen or more young girls from New England who are from prominent families, who are being educated and living and eating and drinking at this school for their education up through until they complete high school. In 1831, Prudence Campbell admits one of the servants who are working the school who is African and American. Now, the landowners and families who are sending their girls there say, hey, if you let this African American girl, if you let this black girl be in class with our daughters, we're withdrawing all your tuition money. And you can only imagine today, I don't know where you're from, who's listening to this, but if all of the people who pay tuition for a private school threaten something, today most likely the school would give in to what they say very, very quickly because they live off the tuition. But Prudence says, all right, no problem. I don't care. And so the prominent and moneyed families of the city, they sink the school. It's really in trouble now. And so Prudence Campbell, she's no pushover. She decides not to give in to the town at all. In fact, she says, okay, this is a school only for black girls. And what's really interesting, and I want you to pay attention to how these things work. So I have no interest in where you are politically or your family or your future, because this is history. I only want you to see how race or these types of issues may work in your current world or your future. So when she does this, the families in and around her city begin to put pressure on state legislature, and only a few years later they pass a law in which you cannot educate an African American in a school like this. So now they say, okay, not only have we withdrawn all our money from you, but we're going to make laws which make what you've now decided to do, since you escalated, illegal. And so she is jailed for this and goes to court for it. And so you can look to yourselves in Wikipedia or any other location how this resolved. But I find it interesting that, as a historian of American history, that this even came up, and that when not only did she say, okay, your girls can go somewhere else, I'm just going to make a black school, that this even became a problem. Again, in the North in the 1830s, even that became a problem. Moving on to what's more in the reading, we find that African Americans are definitely involved in the abolitionist movement. You can kind of check out some of these things. For example, they will create January 1st as a freedom celebration. They'll create newspapers to advocate for the abolition of slavery. And so you'll find that, again, African Americans, and white Americans are all involved in this process, but they remain a minority among white Americans. There is quite a bit of resistance to abolitionists. There will be mobs sent in to disrupt meetings. If they don't like what's happening in their schools, they might flood the PTA meetings or the school curriculum committees. This might sound familiar to you today. This goes on today. Again, doesn't make one side right or wrong. It is merely an understanding that these issues are at issue still today. Elijah Lovejoy was killed for his abolitionist activities in Philadelphia, of all places, in 1838, and there would be even a violence against people's bodies, like Jonathan Walker, who received a branding in his hand, S for slave stealer, down there on the bottom right. Here's one more photograph of that. Okay. Another issue that you'll notice is feminism, and that is the advocacy of some men and many women, but not all men and not all women, towards gender equality before the law and political gender equality, remember, in terms of voting and holding office. So Sojourner Truth holds an interesting position because she's advocating for both. But before we go there, when you are looking at disunion in the next unit, which will become a big assignment for you, I want you to pay attention to things that are developing. One is, and the biggest one, meaning it becomes the most effective, is the development of an ideology, especially within white America, of free soil, free labor. And what they're suggesting with this is that every person should control and have the freedom to control, right? This is the book's Give Me Liberty. Their own piece of land as a farmer or where they work as a laborer. So if you don't, again, all of you imagine yourself graduating from college. If you lived in a system that says, you know what, you don't get to work where you want to freely, and if you wanted to buy land and operate it, you can't do that. You would kind of say, wait, that's not what freedom is. And that's what these people are saying as well. And this ideology starts to develop against slavery of all things. And it's going to be very powerful. And there will be an increase in the idea that America is for all adults, all humans, and it should not be racially restricted. And that the idea that, hey, back in 1776 when we had the Declaration of Independence and we said, man is created equal, that's the real America, not the Constitution from 1787, which does not say that and is in fact supportive of slavery. And for item number C, you'll see an increase in the use of liberty to rebrand things like the Liberty Bell. And just keep your eye on that because as a historian, I've noticed that today, right? So if a group, a part of Eastern Washington wants to make a 51st state and then call it Liberty, they're doing so in ways very different from the group who's doing the Liberty Bell. That's for sure. But they're invoking the same language, the same rhetoric, right? I'll move away from but from significantly different reasons. Going back then to the 1830s and beyond, then these groups are starting to be, these reformers are challenging racial inequality, and they're invoking Christian ideas such as, aren't I a brother or sister? Aren't I a human? Aren't we all the same before Jesus? So it's kind of interesting. Okay, now the second of the two large ones is a reform movement towards gender equality. Back then they would use the word sex equality. And in your reading, you're going to read about the different levels of rights for men and women in the political realm, the legal realm, and for getting jobs. And these are the areas in which feminists, in what generally historians call the first wave of feminism, push up against. They are advocating for equal political rights, legal and civil rights, economic opportunities, and against an idea that by nature women should be domesticated within this new industrial revolution home. And in your reading, you'll see that Stanton, Mott, and others are involved in this process, and that the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 at Seneca Falls is one of our best ways to understand what the central ideas were. All right, so this unit full of reform will move part of America towards reform, and as such, when we turn to the breakup of the Union, will help us understand how that happened.